Hey, what's going on, guys? At UFC 297 in the post-fight press conference, at the very tail end, Dana White confirmed that Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler would not be taking place on June 29th like Conor McGregor announced on New Year's Day. A lot of people may have missed this clip because it was at the tail end. Dana White started to leave and then somebody asked him a last question referring to Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. I want to take a look at that clip in this video, but another clip from another interview that I want to take a look at in this video where Dana White hints at the possibility it may be Conor McGregor versus someone else. It may not be Michael Chandler. Once Michael Chandler sees this clip, he's going to have a mental breakdown. He's going to have to pop in a Creed CD. He's going to have to smoke a carton of cigarettes because he's going to be mentally broken, because Dana White flat out says it may be Conor McGregor versus someone else, not Michael Chandler. And the reason I think this interview is so important is because it wasn't posted anywhere. It wasn't posted on Twitter. It was not posted on YouTube. I had to dig it up from the Sportsnet website. I'll link it down in the description. And I got it from Aaron Bronstetter, who also works for Sportsnet. I saw a tweet. I believe he tweeted out a kind of quote from this interview. And you'll hear the guy at the post-fight presser kind of hint at it as well. But nobody actually ever showed the clip. So I dug it up. We're going to take a look at it. And Dana White confirms that it may not be Michael Chandler. So we're going to take a look at that in a second. But it's crazy to me that now it is almost February of 2024, and we still don't have a Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler fight announcement. Oh, wait, it's not crazy to me, because I've been adamant since it was announced for The Ultimate Fighter that I did not believe that Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler was going to happen. Now, I've kind of racked my brain, and there's been different reasons why I believe that this fight didn't happen. I believe USADA was delaying it for a while, but I believe there's another reason. And I'm going to break down in this video the real reason I believe that Dana White has not been able to acquire a date for Conor McGregor's return. And I don't feel like anyone else has said this yet. Maybe somebody has, maybe I've missed it, but I think there's some kind of tells in this interview from the post-fight presser that kind of hints at what's going on with Conor McGregor, even though there's been so much speculation. So I want to start off with the clip from the post-fight presser where Dana White is asked about Conor McGregor and is that date official, where Conor McGregor on New Year's Day said, me versus Michael Chandler, 185 pounds, June 29th. And I think a lot of people got confused by this information, because Ariel Helwani then confirmed it. Ariel Helwani usually is a credible source for news, but the problem is I believe Ariel Helwani's source was Conor McGregor. How many times has Conor McGregor fake retired and all the MMA media members run with it? How many times has Conor McGregor said, I'm fighting here, I'm fighting there? Last year, I believe it was March of last year, Conor McGregor went on the MMA Hour and was saying he was going to fight twice in 2023. I've been telling you guys since the jump. It was announced in early February 2023. I did not believe that this fight would happen. Definitely not in 2023. It obviously didn't happen. And now we're in 2024. We're 1 month in. We still don't even have a date for it yet. But let's listen. Let's start off with the UFC 297 post-fight presser. I believe this is only like a minute of kind of information from Dana, but I believe there's one telling quote from Dana in this, and I'm going to point it out, and we're going to reference it later. But let's take a listen.
Just one real quick, actually, Dana.
Yeah.
Since it's on the topic of Roadhouse, that leads to Conor McGregor. Can you clarify what's going on with him? Because he announced that he's fighting June 29th. Obviously, nothing official has come from the UFC.
Right.
Look at that shit-eating grin, by the way. Look at that shit-eating grin. Dana's always got a shit-eating grin.
Is that what you guys are leaning towards? I know you made some comments this week, too, in an interview, I think, with Sportsnet, and maybe it was taken a little bit out of context.
He's referencing the Sportsnet interview that we're going to look at later in this video. I'm going to show you that interview. It was not really posted anywhere. It's on the Sportsnet website.
In terms of like the clarity. So where do things stand with Conor right now? Is he fighting in June?
No.
Michael Chandler just audibly gasped when he said no. Dana just said no. Could he be any more clear? Is Conor McGregor fighting in June? No. No. Michael Chandler is listening to a Creed CD. He's listening to One Last Breath right now. He is 6 foot from the edge as we speak. Dana White said no. Michael Chandler is planning his entire camp, leaving his family. He did an interview recently with Brett Okamoto. I did a video on it. He is leaving his family to start a training camp and planning for a 185-pound bout with Conor McGregor in June. There you hear from Dana White himself, no. Why wouldn't Dana White and the UFC want their biggest star back in the octagon? We're going to get to that later, but listen.
When Conor's ready to fight, we'll announce it.
When Conor's ready to fight, we'll announce it. I want you to remember that quote for later in this video. When Conor is ready to fight. That is very important.
That's what we do.
June is a possibility, though?
I don't know.
Okay.
June is a possibility. I don't know. Could Dana have been any clearer there? No. Is June a possibility? I don't know. Dana has no idea what's going on right now with Conor, because I'm going to tell you what's going on behind the scenes here in a second. But we're going to skip ahead, or not skip ahead. We're going to go to the Sportsnet interview. This is the Sportsnet interview where Dana White talked to, I don't even remember this guy's name, but he was asked specifically about Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. And if you think that first clip made Michael Chandler audibly gasp, wait till he hears this clip. Because in this clip, Dana White hints that it may be Conor McGregor versus somebody else. But let's listen. By the way, I hate the way this interviewer asked the question. The way he phrases the question makes me want to jump through the screen and treat him like I'm in a club in Mexico at 53 and he's my wife. But let's take a listen.
Okay, so where are we on Conor McGregor, glasses of red wine, social media, and Michael Chandler?
What talk about the dumbest way to phrase a question. Dumbest way to phrase a question. But he's referencing the video of Conor McGregor on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day where he's drinking red wine and laughing it up and saying he's fighting Michael Chandler on June 29th at 185 pounds. Listen to Dana's response.
So McGregor will be back this year, possibly him and Chandler.
Possibly him and Chandler. Possibly him and Chandler. Man, I'm starting to feel bad for Michael Chandler at this point. Possibly against Michael Chandler. Just possibly. It's not confirmed. They didn't do a whole, Ultimate Fighter season. I mean, they ran that from what? They announced that in February. I think they started filming in April. They filmed from like April to June, and then it aired or something along those lines. It's finished airing. The live finale was on UFC 292, which was in August. We're talking 5 months ago. 5 months ago. You had Michael Chandler throughout this whole process guaranteeing that he'd be fighting Conor McGregor before the end of 2023, when meanwhile, nobody's even talking to Chandler. Chandler's literally a Conor McGregor groupie at this point. He's a pawn, and I actually feel bad for him because Conor McGregor's ruined his career. But let's listen to what else Dana White had to say here. It's nothing really that big, but I wanted to point out, possibly against Michael Chandler.
We'll see how this whole thing plays out. I have no idea what you're talking about. Glasses of red wine.
Mr. Chandler.
And then they show the video of Conor McGregor announcing the fight initially. So there you go. You have that. Now, what's actually going on here? I still do not believe that Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler will inevitably happen. But you have Conor McGregor, who's one of the biggest stars in the sport. He's been adamant he wants to fight for a while now. You have Dana White, who's typically money hungry. He's going to want his biggest star back, who sells the most pay-per-views. You have Michael Chandler ready to take Conor McGregor into an NBA public restroom at any point in time. He's been brown-nosing him hard for literal years. A grown man brown-nosing another grown man for literal years just to potentially get a fight, and he may not even get it now. I mean, this is craziness for Michael Chandler. I don't think there's anyone that's single-handedly ruined their career as much as Michael Chandler has in the past 2 years. But initially, we kind of had the excuse, well, USADA. You have to be in the USADA pool for 6 months. Test it by USADA for 6 months before you are eligible to return. So that way, you couldn't jump out of the USADA pool, abuse PEDs like Conor McGregor has been, abusing banned substances at least, and then jumping back in, still getting benefits from those substances while you're fighting. But the UFC just got rid of USADA. The UFC essentially got rid of USADA for Conor McGregor. Well, USADA was gone first of the year. Conor McGregor announced the fight basically first of the year. Well, I think technically it was New Year's Eve, but USADA was gone New Year's Eve. I have a whole theory on that as well. I'll link that video down in the description. So why hasn't a fight been announced yet? I've been thinking about it, and I've been thinking about it, and I've been thinking about it. I thought for a while, like maybe it has to do with Conor McGregor's drug use, and I think that could still be a possibility. But even though we all know that Conor McGregor's, out there doing things he probably shouldn't be, there's no 100% confirmation on that. And I don't think Dana White would care that much anyway. Now that all the drug testing's in-house, the worst that he could worry about is Conor getting popped by a commission for illicit drug use during fight week, because they basically only do in-competition drug testing. So what else could it be? I want to remind you of a fighter that recently left the organization, Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou left the organization in January of 2023. Now, Francis Ngannou wanted to fight out his deal for a while, and he was iced by the UFC, but eventually he fought out his deal. His last fight on his contract was against Cyril Gane in January of 2022. Now, the UFC has a bunch of restrictions in their contracts, essentially holding fighters hostage. And there's people who think these restrictions in contracts violate antitrust law. There is an antitrust lawsuit going on between fighters, a class action lawsuit started mainly by older fighters, between the UFC and these fighters over the last 10, 12 years. Now, the reason that is pertinent is because in 2017, there was a clause added to UFC contracts introducing a sunset clause, which currently a UFC fighter signs a contract, and then if they don't fight out their deal, they're stuck in their contract, which I understand they signed the contract, but if they fight out their deal, they then are, if they're a champion at the end of their deal, they're then required for 1 year or 3 fights, whatever comes first. Then there's an exclusive negotiating period between that fighter and the UFC, which means that fighter can't talk to anyone else. Then after that, the UFC has the rights to match. Well, because of this antitrust lawsuit in 2017, the UFC decided to add a sunset clause into their contracts to make it look better when it came to litigation. And what this sunset clause stated was a fighter could not be held for more than 5 years from the time they signed the contract. Now, they have since altered this. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But in 2017, when they added this clause, Francis Ngannou signed his contract afterwards. So the reason Francis Ngannou was inevitably ended up getting out of his contract was because of the sunset clause. In January of 2023, he was injured for the last year, but he was still under contract with the UFC. The reason he was able to get out of his contract is because of that sunset clause. It had been 5 years since the beginning of his contract. Now, the UFC has since altered that, but that's not really super pertinent to right now. And what does that have to do with Conor McGregor? Well, I want to talk about Francis Ngannou for another 30 seconds, because Francis Ngannou, since getting out of his contract, he's gone and signed a mega deal with PFL, making him the highest paid heavyweight in MMA history. He's then also signed on to box Tyson Fury, made the biggest paycheck of his entire career, and now he has a massive boxing match lined up with Anthony Joshua that's going to make him another massive payday in Saudi Arabia. I've talked about it ad nauseum. I'll link a video down in the description. The UFC wanted Francis Ngannou to be a cautionary tale and not an inspiration. That backfired. Francis Ngannou was an inspiration. Well, what does this have to do with Conor McGregor, Joey? I know you're probably wondering that. I went back and I started digging up on Conor McGregor's contract. And I found out Conor McGregor signed a contract. It was announced on September 20th, 2018, right before the Khabib Nurmagomedov fight. That was a 6-fight deal, including the Khabib Nurmagomedov fight. Now, I know that's 6 years ago, but we'll get to that in a second. Well, he fought Khabib Nurmagomedov. Then after that, he fought Donald Cerrone in 2020. Then after that, he fought Dustin Poirier twice. That means he has fulfilled 4 of his 6 fights. That means unless Conor McGregor signed another contract in between there, he only has 2 fights left on his contract. The UFC does not like to let fighters, especially fighters they deem high-value fighters, they do not like to let them fight out their deals. So the last person they want to fight out their deal is superstar Conor McGregor. That is the last person they want to fight out their deal. Now, I know you're probably wondering, well, what does this have to do with the sunset clause? This is where it ends up being highly speculative. I believe that there is a chance fighters, especially of Conor McGregor's stature, and a high-profile fighter like Conor, renegotiate their deals. They may not extend the terms, but they may renegotiate the monetary value of their contract. So what I find particularly interesting, even on the surface, a 6-fight deal, he's fought 4 of his fights. So bare minimum, he's down to his last 2 fights. That sunset clause was added in 2017. Conor signed his contract in 2018. So that means potentially he has that sunset clause in his contract. But it's already been, this October will already be 6 years. So it's already been 5 years as of last October. So how does the sunset clause come into play? Well, what's highly speculative about it is, again, typical, sometimes high-profile fighters will renegotiate their contracts after every fight. And it's not always after every fight, but it can be more often than just at the end of their term. You know, Conor McGregor is not going to renegotiate his contract, wait 5 years, 6 fights, and then renegotiate his contract. He's going to renegotiate it every 1, 2, maybe 3 fights a max. Now, the Khabib Nurmagomedov fight, which took place in October 2018, that pay-per-view sold well over 2 million pay-per-view buys. So I believe there is a very high probability going into that Donald Cerrone fight in 2020, Conor McGregor could have renegotiated his contract. Now, when he renegotiated his contract, it might have stayed the same term, it may have stayed the same number of fights, but it may have increased his pay. And if he did that going into that Donald Cerrone fight, guess what? He would have signed a new contract in January of 2020. So what is 5 years from January 2020? That is January of 2025. Now, the sunset clause could not come into effect at all. Maybe Conor McGregor's just had a 6-fight deal. He's trying to fight out a 6-fight deal. But imagine if that's true. Imagine if he did re-sign a new contract. They stayed the same terms. They stayed the same number of fights. They increased the monetary worth of the contract. And imagine he signed that before the Donald Cerrone fight. It only makes sense because he took like a little over a year off after the Khabib fight. And also, that pay-per-view sold over 2 million pay-per-view buys. That is the biggest UFC pay-per-view in history. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility. Conor McGregor and his manager were like, you know what, we got to go to the UFC and renegotiate our contract. I've said this before. Conor McGregor is the most underpaid fighter on the roster. Then on top of that, now he re-signed that new contract in 2020. The UFC hasn't changed that clause. That clause from 2017 that Francis Ngannou used is still there in 2020. So Conor McGregor is now looking at Francis Ngannou. He's like, wait a second. Francis Ngannou's getting $10, $20 million from Saudi Arabia. How much could I get from Saudi Arabia? And also, Conor McGregor's been at every Saudi Arabia event, essentially. The government of Saudi Arabia is literally paying Conor McGregor to be there. Then on top of that, recently you have the Saudi Arabia, I forgot his name, the guy who's kind of overseeing all of it, recently said he's been asking the UFC to bring Conor McGregor there. So they want Conor McGregor there. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Conor McGregor is thinking, I'm coming back from a serious injury. Why do I want to get thrown in there with Michael Chandler? Why do I want to get thrown in there with Michael Chandler, who's out there training 24/7? He's looking for pictures of me lifting heavy weights online. Let me just wait out my sunset clause. Let me just wait till January of 2025. Now, maybe because Conor McGregor was so high profile, maybe somehow they didn't put that clause in his contract. But either way, if you don't want to think, okay, maybe he doesn't have that clause, Conor McGregor only has 2 fights left on his deal. The UFC does not want Conor McGregor to fight out his deal. And also Conor McGregor, while in Saudi Arabia, was talking about boxing Manny Pacquiao recently. How much do you think Saudi Arabia would pay Conor McGregor to come there? You're looking at maybe 50 million, 60 million. The UFC's probably paying Conor McGregor 15 or 25 million, I would say max. So you're talking doubling his pay, 100 to 200% increase in his pay if he just waits for 1 more year. And also, he's going to get matchups that are potentially favorable to him. Rather than coming back and fighting Michael Chandler for 15 million, Michael Chandler for 20 million, meanwhile Conor's generating 2 million pay-per-view buys. Saudi Arabia doesn't care about pay-per-view buys. They just care about spectacle. And there's nothing better than spectacle. So with all that said, there could be a million different things going on. But at the bare minimum, I believe this is contract negotiations between Conor McGregor and the UFC. You heard Dana White earlier. When Conor McGregor's ready to fight, and he said that a couple times over the course of the last few months when asked about it. When does Dana White always say that? When he's talking about a fighter that's trying to negotiate a new deal. And then when it starts to get a little bit sour, Dana White says, they don't want to fight. They don't want to fight. He kind of starts to get a little bit more harsh. Oh, they don't want to fight. They don't want to fight anyone. He's scared of John Jones. If you're talking about Francis Ngannou, when it was John Jones who was negotiating, he's scared of Francis Ngannou. But Dana White definitely doesn't want to piss off Conor McGregor because while the UFC doesn't need Conor McGregor, the UFC does not want Conor McGregor to then now be another inspiration to other fighters where they look at Conor McGregor and they're like, wait a second, everyone's going here and get more money. And not that everyone is Conor McGregor, not that everyone's Francis Ngannou. The UFC does not want that headache. So I truly believe at the bare minimum, Conor McGregor's got 2 fights left on his deal. The UFC does not want him to fight it out. The worst case scenario for the UFC is Conor McGregor is potentially waiting for that sunset clause, which may be in January of 2025, which is now a year later. So the UFC has about a year to work this out. And they're thinking, okay, we can come to a deal. Now, the one last thing I want to mention, and to kind of tie this all together, and again, this is highly speculative, but at the bare minimum, I believe there is contract negotiations going on between Conor McGregor and the UFC and Dana White, and I'm very, very confident in that analysis. But one thing I thought was very, very interesting is Conor McGregor actually put out a tweet tonight. I've been meaning to make this video for a week. I haven't had time. I've been sick. I've been deathly ill. I'm starting to feel a little bit better. I'm finally making the video. But Conor McGregor put out a tweet a couple hours ago, and he said, McGregor on 300 seals the deal. Now, that could be just Conor blowing smoke up everyone's ass. Maybe he does return on 300 against Michael Chandler. Maybe Dana White's going to pull a rabbit out of his hat. It made sense from the jump that they were going to put McGregor on UFC 300, but now they've announced a couple title fights. They would have to figure out how they would pay those fighters pay-per-view points because they wouldn't want to pay them pay-per-view points with Conor McGregor. But Conor McGregor, they could be getting close to the finish line. I really, truly believe if Conor does return to the UFC, they will announce a new contract. But maybe McGregor is trying to negotiate, I want to be on UFC 300, because UFC 300 is already going to be a mega card. With or without Conor McGregor, it doesn't matter. Just because of the number alone, and it's already pretty stacked, it's going to be a mega card. And I truly believe Conor McGregor knows the worth of being on that card. Even for someone like Conor, it will help raise his profile. I know that sounds crazy, but it is worthwhile to be on UFC 300. Conor McGregor was supposed to be on UFC 200. He didn't want to show up to media days. They bumped him to UFC 202. So maybe Conor McGregor and the UFC are getting close to a finish line, and he's thinking, you know what? Give me that headliner spot on UFC 300, and everything is great, because guess what? Maybe that UFC 300 number is only worth 500,000 pay-per-view buys. Maybe just the number alone is worth that many pay-per-view buys. I think just the card as it stands with the number and the level of fights they've already added with guys like Yuri Prochazka, who's already headlined a pay-per-view. You also have Charles Oliveira, who's already a bit of a star as well. You have Justin Gaethje, who's headlined a pay-per-view. I mean, how many fighters on this card have headlined pay-per-views before? Quite a few. That's worth a lot of money to Conor McGregor. And I know he's going to be the main drawing power, but if he's already drawing, let's say 1.5 million by himself or 2 million by himself, I'm just throwing out random numbers, how much is the rest of that worth? It's worth quite a bit. I think this pay-per-view most likely does close to 1 million pay-per-view buys, depending on the main event, which they've not yet announced. So that's a lot of monetary value for Conor McGregor. So maybe they're getting close to finalizing a contract for Conor McGregor's return, and maybe he's saying, you know what, put me on 300, and that's the last little bit of bargaining I want to do, and that'll seal the deal. I will sign the contract, because being on 300 is an increase in monetary value for Conor McGregor, just based off of all the things in the pay-per-view buys that I just mentioned that come along with this mega card that's going to be promoted that fans are already obsessed with. So I truly believe it is a contract situation going on with Dana White and the UFC. I don't believe that Conor McGregor will ultimately end up on 300, but I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up happening. I'm wondering if it's going to be against Michael Chandler, though, because I don't even think Conor likes Michael Chandler at all, the way he's been brown-nosing him. I think Conor's put off by it a little bit, and it almost ruins the fight, in my opinion. I almost don't want to see Chandler get the fight just so we can laugh at him, because he's absolutely butchered his career over the last 2 years, to the point I almost feel bad for him, because Conor's kind of ruined his career. But I really, truly believe behind the scenes, there's contract negotiations going on, and I think there is a chance 1 year from now, Conor McGregor could be using the sunset clause to leave the UFC and go box in Saudi Arabia. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.